audience a chance to tune in, let me just share a few operational notes. We hope to make this an interactive session today, or as interactive as Zoom can be. And so feel free to send in questions throughout the presentation. Direct them to Renee Lucas, our engagement manager. And they'll be answered immediately or brought up later during Q&A, which will be moderated by our partner from the Mayor's Office, Ayana Polk, Manager of Communications and Outreach. We'll try to get to them all. Also, please remember to mute yourself when listening, just to cut down on the background noise. And finally, as always, I want to thank our anchor signers, Arbella Insurance, Mass General Brigham, Mass Mutual, Putnam Investments, State Street, and Red Hat for their continued generous support, which allows us to collect, analyze, and share the wage gap data, which we'll be talking about today. So let us begin. Welcome, Compact Signers, to the Q1 briefing session for 2022. I'm Kim Borman, Executive Director of the Boston Women's Workforce Council. You're going to hear a little bit more from me today than is typical. I'll be presenting a brief recap of the wage gap measurements numbers and helping to answer any questions you may have, along with our co-chairs, Evelyn Murphy and Kathy Minahan. We suggested you come prepared with your own internal numbers today, not to tell us what they are, but to use them as a reference and to discuss the implications of our data, the BWWC data, against what your company is doing in terms of closing the gender and racial wage gaps. Ev will lead that discussion, and I'm sure it will be lively. So with that, let us get started. We start today really with the mantra of the Boston Women's Workforce Council. We're all about metrics. We're all about understanding what's working and what's not working. We really feel like if you don't see it, you can't change it. And that's the premise behind our gender racial wage gap measurement that we do every 2 years. We want to be able to give you a community snapshot of how our compact signers are doing in terms of closing the gender and racial wage gap at their organizations. So this year, the data was collected anonymously in May of 2021. It went back to, remember, December 31st of 2020. We saw an increase this year in terms of the number of employers, about 9% more who gave us their data, and particularly important, the number of employees, which went up about 14%. Our data now reflects 13.45% of the employees, 81% of the industries in Greater Boston. In terms of demographics, we have in our data a little bit more women than men, 58%, than the gender breakdown in Greater Boston workforce. So we just want you to understand the comparison. And we also have more people of color. And so ours is at 35% people of color within our demographics, where it's closer to 31% in Greater Boston. It's not that much of a difference, but it's somewhat. So let me start by going through some of the data. Each section, I'm going to start with a definition of how we look and calculate this number, because it's a little bit different than sometimes what you'll hear in terms of pay audits. So we want you to understand the difference. The gender wage gap, as we see it, is the average difference in compensation between working men and working women. So you take all the men you have at your company and see what they're earning and compare it to what all the women at your company are earning. So our number in 2021 was 30 cents. That's the gender wage gap that we saw. There On average, women are paid 30 cents less on every dollar than men. This is the same as we saw in 2019, which I've been asked recently, are you disappointed in this number? Sure, we're disappointed. We wanted to see, we wanted it to narrow. However, there were labor economists from probably, I would say, late summer who predicted that we would see an artificial narrowing of the gender wage gap because so many people, especially women of color, had left from the lower salary positions. And so the average would artificially seem to go up in terms of what people were earning. We didn't see that in Boston. In fact, Boston employers kept their workforces intact. The proportion of what we saw this year versus 2019 was very similar. So we believe that the Boston employers were trying very hard to keep their workforces employed. And in fact, we saw a 12% increase in salaries across the board. When you look at performance pay, when you add that into the total compensation, the wage gap increases to 35 cents. And we think this is likely due to the fact that women, and particularly women of color, are not even given the opportunities to be in the kinds of positions, usually more senior positions, where you would earn a high amount of performance pay. The gap varies by job category. There really are only two job categories: administrative and labor helpers, which is defined as like construction laborers, forest and conservation workers, ground maintenance. Those are the only two categories here where women were earning the same as men. Everywhere else, you can see the big discrepancy in earnings by job category. In particular, you can see it in executives in the senior level and also in sales, which happen to be two categories where it's possible to earn a great deal of money in performance pay. Next, we'll talk about the racial wage gap. This calculation is the average difference in compensation between all your white employees and all your employees of color. And it does include men in this calculation. Oops. We saw actually a decrease in the racial wage gap this year. It went from 25 cents down to 24 cents. And that may not sound like a lot, but when you have the World Economic Council saying it could take 130 years to close the gender wage gap, we'll take a cent in terms of the racial wage gap. It does increase to 28 cents when you look at performance pay. And the reason, of course, is that we have people of color earning almost 2.5 times less in performance pay than white workers. And again, we believe this goes to the opportunity to even be in these more senior jobs where performance pay is a factor. The last calculation that we look at is the gender and racial wage gap. The average difference in compensation between women of a certain race and white men. As you can see, women earned less than men across all the racial groups. When you sort out white women and you look at it against women of color against white men, you can see that the white women were at this average of 30 cents. Women of color, however, their gender wage gap is much higher. It's 35 cents. So when you dig a little deeper and you look at it by race, you can see where that 35 cents is coming from. We have 3 racial groups that are at the 70 cents, the average, meaning they earn 70 cents on the dollar. So the gap is 30 cents. White women, Asian women, indigenous women. Now, Asian women and indigenous women actually, they narrowed their gap in our data this year compared to 2019. But at the lower end of the scale, Black African women at 49 cents, earning 49 cents on the dollar, or a 51 cent gap. Hispanic, Latino women earning 45 cents on the dollar or a 55-cent gap. These two groups are at the same gaps as they were in 2019. And it's not only disappointing, it's disturbing, of course, because we know that these are more than just numbers. What people take home in their paycheck is a determinant of what goes on in their life. It determines where they can live. It determines where their kids can go to school. It determines oftentimes what kind of access they have to healthcare. So we've got to change this, and we've got to figure out how we can have an impact so that we don't have people lagging behind. The last numbers I will tell you today are actually wage gaps by industry. And it's the first time we've really reported on it by industry. Because of the stringent confidentiality, we only report on industries where we get at least 8 organizations to give us their data. Also, we should make a note that healthcare is a separate category, and we didn't get 3 in healthcare, so you won't see that this year. However, we do have nonprofit, so we've separated out hospitals from the nonprofit. So interestingly enough, the two industries that have the most women in them, nonprofit and professional services, also had the largest wage gaps. In particular, if you look at nonprofit, the wage gap was at 39 cents compared to the average of 30 cents. And I think we were really surprised by this number, considering how many women we know in the nonprofit world. One thing I will show you also is that in finance, 23 cents, that is, second to the lowest wage gap that we saw. So the final thoughts I'll leave you with today is the idea of just doing the math. You've probably heard that from us before. We asked you to come to this session having done the math. It is so important to periodically look at these directional numbers, the gender wage gap, racial wage gap, gender and racial wage gap, to see how you're making progress at your own organization, and then use those numbers against what we put together as a benchmark. So with that, I will stop sharing. I'm going to hand it over to Ayanna so that we can answer some of your questions.
Thank you, Kim, and good morning, everyone. My name is Ayanna Polk. I am the Communications and Outreach Manager for the Mayor's Office of Women's Advancement here for the City of Boston. We are the public partner to the VWWC, and we're really excited to take a deeper dive into the findings from our last data collection cycle and really, start to tease them out with your questions, because I know that we've gotten a lot of responses from our initial sharing of the data. And with this time, definitely want to answer some questions. I know that we received some ahead of time, and I did see some in the chat. So we will start to talk more about the data. But now, just to let you know, I know that we do have a lot of questions, not only about the numbers and doing the math, but really about the larger implications of the work that we're doing. And we'll go into discussion with that later on, but we're going to use this time here to answer questions about the report and the data and the things that Kim just spoke about. So if there are some more larger discussions about what those call to actions are, the next steps, we'll probably address them later on in our time together. But I do know one thing that has come up with our report that's come out. One question that we consistently get was when we're talking about those numbers, how can our organizations and our signers use this information to benchmark their own organizations?
Oh, I can start that. question is the way they would benchmark it is understand this is a community snapshot, what we put together. So it's all our compact signers. So what we're asking you to do is to do the numbers internally and use those internal numbers against what we have to see where you compare. So again, it's just doing the numbers internally so that you have an idea of where you stand.
Awesome. And then when it comes to the numbers and you're looking at our data set compared to other numbers, why is the BWWC wage gap larger compared to the Massachusetts wage gap, for example?
Doesn't it kind of depend, Diana, on the data that you use? And we use data reported directly to us by the industries and the companies involved who are signers of the compact and who, I believe, out of an incredibly great sense of commitment to this effort, have been willing to report their data with significant confidentiality so that we can really know what's going on. Because frankly, I think we have the only data in the country, aggregate data for a particular group that's actually accurate. There are other wage gap measures that are estimated from two different sources, what's reported to the EEOC and what's reported for purposes of, why am I gapping? But anyway, for national purposes, Ev, you know what you know the series I'm talking about.
Yeah, the Labor Department, the Census Bureau, and the Bureau of Labor
The
Statistics.
Census Bureau, right. And the Census Bureau is what they get it from what people report as opposed to what industries report. So any other wage gap you see, which isn't calculated the way we calculate it, comes from two different sources, which may or may not be covering the same group of people. We know ours cover the same group of people because they're from our reporters, and we're the only source of data like that.
Thank you for that, Kathy. And
Diana, if I can just add.
yeah, go on.
Kathy's made an important distinction. The distinction is the other data from the Labor Department that goes into the Massachusetts state wage gap and other wage gaps, even for metropolitan areas throughout the country, comes through the Census Bureau and the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And that is employees reporting after the fact what they thought they earned last year or in the previous thing. So we have employer data straight from their payrolls as contrasted with the memory of employees. It's a very different data set. And we truly, as Kathy said, believe we have the most accurate portrayal of the wage gaps.
Could be the wish list of the employees on the other.
Yeah.
And anything's possible. We know ours is accurate. It may not be great, I mean, in terms of what it's saying about our community, and what it's saying, the people that report to us, you have to believe, have really thought about this and want to do it well. And sometimes they're surprised to see what the data are.
Yes. And thinking about that data, there's also a question about the type of wage data collected. Are we thinking about, what kind of information we'd be collecting? For example, W-2 earnings, because they provide a valuable approximation of what workers are taking home, and just thinking about things like pre-tax deductions and so on. Just wanted to kind of pick your brain about the information that you collect and how you use that in the reporting.
Well, we get this question a lot. Why do we just use cash and cash performance? And the bottom line is we're trying to use something that everybody has. We're trying to make it a comparable data set. And we know that is sort of the lowest common denominator. It's also everything that we get is based on everything that we're asking you for is based on the EEOC data request, which many employers, people who have 50 or more employees, have to put in, have to give to the federal government every year. So we've tried to keep everything very standard so it's not such a heavy lift. The wage information in particular, however, we've kept it, again, at a standard level so that we can compare across different organizations. It's not that we couldn't perhaps research putting in other kinds of fringe benefits that people get, but we just want to make sure that what we're comparing is apples to apples.
And we do have information, which I think you reported, Kim, on bonuses.
Yes. Right.
And that makes the data look usually far worse.
Right.
Well, and the final point is, we want to be respectful of the signers. There's
Yeah.
a lot of data to be reported, even in our format.
Right.
So we're trying to find the least burdensome set of data, which gives us a picture of the reality
Yeah.
for our target audience, but do it in a way that we minimize the burden of reporting.
Yeah, from the beginning, the data we wanted to report was data they already had to report.
Right. Right.
The categories were set, and there may not be a single report that has both sides, but they do have to report both wages and data about people within categories.
And thinking about the people that these numbers represent, I know we've gotten a lot of questions around the configuration of different workplaces, about, for example, what if your organization is largely female? How does that factor into the larger data reporting? Let me see. Okay, so before I move on, I know Nancy in the chat had wanted me to kind of rephrase the question. Just want to make sure that we have that here before we move on to the next one. So the question was about the type of information that's collected when it comes to the submission time for our data collection. We were asking about what other information, pay information that could be used. Some folks asked about why not using W-2 earnings versus the gross income. So it was just asking about what information we collect and why we collect it. But of course, if anyone wants to take a deeper dive into these questions, we're all here to kind of talk more about these things. But pivoting back to the people that these numbers represent, what happens when you have an organization that's largely that has largely women, like we're talking about certain industries that have an overrepresentation of women. What about non-binary folks that share space with us in our workplaces? How do we account for them? And also, when we're talking about closing these gender racial wage gaps, how are we, how are we really like interrogating this information to make sure that we can fix these gaps in the workplace? So I know that's kind of loaded, and I know that's kind of multiple, I'm trying to combine, but just to kind of summarize, talking about what if an organization has an overrepresentation of women, and how does that impact the data? How do non-binary folks factor into the data? And looking at discriminatory practices with this data, how can we make sure that we're not only closing the pay gaps, but making sure that we're creating inclusive workplaces?
Well, I can answer the first two questions, which had to do with if you have all women at your place, you still give us your data, because remember, it's average with everybody else's. So we have over 250 compact signers. So it's important for us to have your data. In terms of, and this is the choice between, right now it's female and male, could we have different gender identity choices? We've discussed it. Again, we're sort of following the lead of the EEOC, but it's something that we could look into. And if it's something that you as employers are asking your employees and are actually getting data back, it's something for us to think about. So it's certainly a good point to research.
It's interesting though, because using the government's definitions and the government reporting makes it clear to everyone based on a standard definition. And I think it might be hard to, on our own, come up with a definition of non-binary unless people are reporting that internally to their organizations, and those organizations are reporting that then to the government, and we can use the standard government definition. So I think it's worth looking at, and I think we need to really get into how the government is going to be handling this. What's going to look like when you report on that sort of thing to the EEOC, if you are reporting on it. EEOC is mostly about numbers. The other data sources are mostly about salaries. They get put together. We get them together in the same reporting cycle. But I think definitions are going to be tough when you start getting into other categories of people than male and female, non-binary categories. Unless there's a standard reporting process.
I think that's important. I think this standardization of reporting, but I also think, as I'm listening to this, it would be interesting to poll our signers and see whether there is a need for this. If there's a request from everybody, then let us think about it. But I think this is a joint collaboration with everybody who's on this call right now. You're the signers, and if this kind of data is important to you, and let's poll the signers to see if this kind of data is important to us. We'll pursue it.
Yeah. I think it's certainly interesting, and in the context of what we're doing here in terms of racial and gender wage gaps.
Yeah.
Definitely. And I know as things progress, as Evelyn said, we are here to listen. So if you do have, an idea or a need that you think that we could all serve together, please feel free to reach out so we can start to have more engaged discussions around the things that you would like to see, because this is a group effort. And the first step is saying that you want to take on this cause, but it's definitely a number of conversations that happen and help us evolve our practices. And thinking about evolving practices, I know COVID-19, I know everyone, it has upended our lives and made us really change the way that we think about work. Quite a few signers on the call today had some questions about how can they use this data to support pay equity in times like this, when we have people reevaluating what the workplace looks like, when it comes to those who can work remotely, those that are essential and work in person. How can we use this data to make sure that we're continuing to create a pathway to equity through COVID and beyond?
That's a really tough question, Ayana, and I'm glad people are thinking about that. One thing that's impressed me in this time of difficulty and people working remotely and so many different issues about the health and the welfare of the workforce, I think the workforce has become more valuable. And women in the workforce and people of color in the workforce, by definition, have also become more valuable because they're harder to come by. Many people have taken this opportunity to reevaluate their lives, perhaps take early retirement, perhaps think about doing something very different with their lives. So companies are finding themselves really having to think about how to keep employees and how to make them happy and how to keep them exercised and really engaged in their work. So I think this is an opportune time for companies to be thinking about paying people equally, because that's going to make a big statement about who they are as employers. You know, and I certainly think it's something that people should, if they feel that their organization is not paying enough attention to salary, and to other sorts of things, to make them equivalent across, you know, the organization, depending on where you are, then they should say something, because it's so now, good workers are in such demand. So I think things have gotten a little better, maybe, at the margin.
Maybe they have. And I agree with Kathy. I think the tight labor market is shifting some of the advantage to employees in how they look at their futures and how they negotiate their
Mhm.
salaries. The one place, Ayanna, I'd be careful, which is this pay equity, because equal pay for equal work or comparable work is already the law.
Yep.
So if we're talking about that, that's just a compliance with the law. If we're talking about the wage gap, the averages, that's a very different way of looking at pay
Yeah.
equity. And the phrase gets used all over the place. So,
Yeah.
and we try hard to standardize this as the wage gap rather than the pay equity, but still it's commonly used. On the
Actually,
wage,
yeah. What you're really looking for is the opportunity to move up,
exactly, that's it.
to be paid equally and then be advanced in your organization. That's what's going to eliminate the wage gaps that we measure.
Exactly.
And the wage gaps that anybody measures. I mean, any measure you ever see of the wage gap, we may have better data because it comes from the same source, but any measurement of the wage gap is going to be looking at how much money paid to a white man, versus how much money paid to women or people of color or whatever in the aggregate. And what that shows is how far up the ladder in terms of higher pay women, people of color, so forth, have moved. Again, this may be an opportunity now to really take advantage of the need for good workers and the scarcity of good workers. You can always hope.
Definitely. Yes, right. And I know I have quite a few other questions over here, but I know I want to definitely give more time for our time with Evelyn to really take a deeper dive into what's next. So I'll kind of end these questions. And of course, like I said, if you ever have more questions, still feel free to share them, because they might serve the next part of the conversation. But we're always welcome to circle back and have a deeper conversation with you individually, or find more opportunities to talk around these questions at a later time. But for each of you, wanted to know, when it comes to the report that came out, was there anything that surprised you, considering the fact that through 2019, from the last report to now, the world has changed so much? So is there anything that that's like on your mind, that when you really started to interrogate the report for yourself, is there anything that stood out for you?
People can talk on this call, right?
Right.
Come on, people.
Was that question directed at us, Ayanna?
Yes, you, but I mean, if anyone does
right.
in the chat, because I think this is a good opportunity for us to
For
think,
anybody to tell us.
as we,
Yeah.
Right.
anything that surprised you all, you're more than welcome to put it in the chat, or raise your hand.
Or speak up
speak?
on,
Yeah,
really? I mean,
This is Mike Grant. I actually work for the city of Boston and have provided the numbers for the last number of years. And the thing that strikes me is, because of anonymity, it's very difficult to look at what the standard deviation is. And, you know, by doing that, saying, well, who's on the top end? Who has a gap that has narrowed significantly from the 30 cents or more? I look at the forum, I look at the process, and believe that BWWC is a focus for inspiration, that you can see not only what people are doing, but what is possible. I understand that anonymity is a critical factor in the data collection, but I would also suggest that, being able to tell those success stories and maybe soliciting the members who are willing to share their success stories, which has been done fabulously for all of the different seminars over the past few years, and sharing within the group, but also to have something that, public facing, is to say, well, here are the companies that are members that have voluntarily shared how well they're doing in this effort. Thank you.
I mean,
Thank
we
you,
really
Michael.
have wanted success stories to be part of what we're talking about here in this conversation and in other conversations we might have, going forward throughout the year. We'd love to hear success stories. We've been very conscious of the fact that a lot of this data is considered to be very sensitive by the companies involved, and we don't know any individual company's data. It's totally disguised to us. It gets reported in such a way and treated in the calculations in such a way that we can't pick it out. So for us to know what you're doing, you have to tell us, which means you have to want to tell us.
We will have,
Of the public sector? Oh, I'm sorry.
well, we will have innovative initiatives, which is a
Right?
award system that we're about to introduce for this year in March. That's an opportunity for you all to apply and tell us what you're doing and what's worked and how you know it's worked. But it's also a very good segue, I think, from what you're saying to where Ev is going, because our next part of this conversation is supposed to be, okay, you saw this, you saw our numbers. What does this mean in terms of what you're doing at your own organization? So with that, Ev, why don't we turn it over for you to start this discussion?
Oh, Michael, you hit it right on the mark. We've got to learn from each other. And in doing that, we move from individual success and then move the overall wage gap as well. So to me, this next segment is to ask all of you, and please understand, everybody who's here has made this pledge to look at their wage gaps and do something about them. So this is a closed group, and we can learn from each other if we start sharing some information. So let me put this as forthrightly as possible and start this discussion, and start it in a way that I urge you, because I can't see who holds up their hand. Just take off your mute button and break in whenever you have something to say. Let me ask you two questions. Who uses this data on the gender and racial wage gaps right now to manage? And if you do use it, how do you use it? Give us some insights. As Mike just said, give us some insights into how you're using it. On the other side, who doesn't use this gender wage gap and racial wage gap to manage right now, and why? The more we can share information, the more we're going to be successful in moving our own numbers. And that's the challenge right now. We really do need to learn from each other. So somebody kick this off and tell us among us, are you using it or not? And how to use it, or why not?
And I have to say, from the very beginning, the anonymity of our data collection has made it possible. That anonymity is our best friend in terms of getting data, and it's our worst friend in terms of knowing who's really on the good side of the spectrum, if you will, versus someone in a company in the middle, or someone not as good. We regard all of our signers as absolute heroes.
Yeah. So somebody start this.
Exactly.
I'm willing to
Hey,
put
Michael.
some things out there. I just don't want to dominate the conversation. So if
Better than us dominating.
well, first off, I'd like to suggest that any public sector partners consider what mandates they have to provide open data as a basis for more fully disclosing as being a partner. Certainly, the city has a great amount of scrutiny that occurs day in and day out, whether it be the Boston Globe or the Herald or, private individuals or other organizations. So there is almost a culture of expectation that we share, fairly detailed information about our workforce and compensation. So just kind of putting that out there as, an understanding that the public sector world is a little bit different than private sector as far as sharing information goes.
When you put that out, let me just ask you one quick question about that. When you put that out and you say you disclose, who in the administration, is there somebody then who manages to that? Or is it just strictly the reporter?
Yeah, the press office and the public information officer, Sean Williams, would respond to FOIA requests, which could be, submitted by anyone, literally anyone. And that would be true of any, city or town across the state.
Michael, do you know that those requests have been made, and can we get the data?
Yeah, well, there's an open data portal, as a matter of fact, which has a variety of details, including an annual earnings, wage earnings component that goes into details by individual. What that doesn't do is break it down. I don't believe it currently breaks it down by ethnicity, but we've provided that as a response to other FOIAs. So I'm not in the position to make commitments in that regard. So I just want to make that clear.
I'm wondering out of this, how much, once you report this data, does anyone within administration, I don't want to single you out in particular, but is there somebody who then manages to that data?
Yes, it is absolutely utilized.
Okay, how?
Looking at both, individual disparity, within a range of job titles, and looking at trends within the city as a whole. Okay. Right now, Mayor Wu and before her, there has been, a great amount of scrutiny given to this topic. What the city has as an advantage in closing the wage gap is that a majority of our employees are on a grade and step scale. So there is equality insofar as, if you're on a grade and step scale, you will see an increase in your earnings following an annual process. So it's very egalitarian in that regard. And the only difference being, at what wage is an individual brought in at. They may not be brought in, and there's attention given to that as well. So it shows how that kind of system, if you focus on that group, promotes equality from a wage standpoint. Then it becomes more of an issue in terms of hiring and recruiting, and looking at the balance within the workforce based on gender. For the non-graded positions, that's something where, great study is given, where consultants will come in and do an analysis and help the city, evaluate, where there may be a disparity or room to, an area to focus on to assess, well, what is the work that's being done and how is it similar or dissimilar?
Mike, can I, in deference, as you said, you don't want to take up all the time here, and I want to shift because I noticed that Kay Wild has got her hand up, but I'd love to talk to you afterwards about this as well, if you've got the time.
There's a really, really important issue, though, that Michael's highlighting, and that's the distinction between equal pay for equal work,
right,
which is the law and has been the law since the 60s, and the wage gap as it's calculated both nationally and by us here in Boston, which is really a measure of where women, people of color are in the scale of things, not in individual jobs, but what those jobs are paid. How many women and people of color are at the top of the pay scale as opposed to the middle or the bottom? That's what you're going to capture.
Yeah.
And that's what you don't get with many of the things that people measure right now in terms of equal pay for equal work.
Exactly. Okay, what's on your mind?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I work for a very small nonprofit of about 13 people,
Mhm.
and no two people there have the same job description or the same job title.
Mhm.
And we're always wondering, how do you tell if the wages are equitable within our organization? How do you compare people's job descriptions, experience, et cetera? Is there a way to break that down so you can say, well, this person supervises a certain number of people, so they're in that category, or this person is, requires a master's level degree? How can we tell within an organization like that if we're being equitable among our employees?
Again, this is equal pay for equal work, which again, it's the situation you describe is difficult and a lot of things, a lot of thinking has to go into it, but it is the law to pay people that are described similarly, similar jobs, equal pay. In the situation you're talking about, we'd be looking at where the salaries of all the men, no matter what jobs they're in, where the salaries are of all the women, no matter what jobs they're in, because what that's going to reflect is where the women are versus the men in terms of higher pay in the aggregate, as opposed to job
Mhm.
equivalent.
And I think it might have been alluded to earlier by one of you, but the EEO classifications are one way that we compare. So if you have someone that's classifying a job, and for EEO 1, let's say, you've got executives as, category 1, you've got professionals as category 2. So even on a very loose level, we can compare titles within the EEO classification for, disparity in pay, because those classifications mean something. They should mean something in terms of how you've created a position and how you've classified it.
That's right. And that's what we see, don't we, Kim?
Yes, we do. We see, we showed the job categories. There's a real disparity, especially in the senior executive area.
Exactly.
Okay,
So
thank you.
Let me reach out to some others here. Kim mentioned at the beginning that we asked you to crunch your own numbers. And I'm wondering who here has done that and how you regarded them, or what, as you interpret them, what does that mean for what you do next? And don't be shy. We're all among friends here.
Yeah, you guys are all the good guys.
Yeah, you are. And that's why, or tell us if,
I can speak a little bit. We
Yeah.
did our numbers,
yep,
and I think where we fall is in that very situation you've just been talking about, the people at the higher ups, the gap is bigger, and the people, in the lower ranks, the gap is smaller. And the same is true with people of color. There are more people kind of at the lower ranks. So when we look at those gaps, it's, where are we getting our workforce? And how can we increase, at the lower level, and so we can bring them up to be at a higher level. And the same with women and men. What are our procedures for advancement within the company? What do we value? So that people can be considered executives or professionals or whatever. So that's what the numbers show us. And so we have found the data useful in that regard. And in fact, we just had a conversation about it yesterday morning because we did crunch the numbers. So we are using the information.
so
Sometimes it's a shock. Was it a shock, Nancy?
No, because we did something kind of earlier. It was a little bit of a shock that it hadn't changed as much as I thought it might be changing, because I don't know, we're a majority female company at the moment, professional services. But I think we compare favorably to, the city numbers, but you know, we're specialized professional services and a smaller company, so you expect that.
Yeah.
But it points out, we are conscious of it. We're always conscious of it when we're looking at salaries every year. So we use that data there. But it's good to take a step back when it's not looking at the individuals, but looking at as a whole. Yeah, there are gaps. There are things that we need to improve. So we wish that more people in our industry would do these surveys so we could get more particular data for our type of company. I don't know what your recruitment mechanisms are, but it is useful.
So Nancy, just for sort of my mindset, having done this and looked at it and said, yeah, you know, it means we need to look at advancement. How often do you think you'll revisit the wage gaps?
I mean, it would be nice to do it, you know, when we do our annual, you know, salary reviews.
Mhm.
You know, there's always time pressures
Sure.
every year. But I looked at it this year and I looked at it a couple of years ago, but it would be nice to do it, you know, every couple of years, probably.
Mhm. Okay, that's helpful.
Yeah.
Other comments?
I'm happy to share.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a lot like Nancy said, it's just being intentional about it. And as one of the signers, you know, VHB is very intentional about having pay equity and reducing the wage gap. I think that the data that we see from the report makes us realize this is still a problem. It's not going away, because I think in our minds, sometimes we tend to feel like, well, we've talked about this a lot. We're very aware of it. We know it's happening. It's getting better. And I think the black and white data shows us this is not a problem that's going away, and there's a lot of work to do. So it is a journey and it is a process. The first step, I think, is the intentionality and the focus, and we're doing that. The second step is, you know, looking at all the incentive compensation, looking at the pay, and doing the work internally. And we do that every year. Every time we look at, you know, raises, bonuses, everything, we're always looking at it. And we have talked to outside consultants about getting a data scientist. And from what I'm hearing from one of our firms, who is a consultant and a trusted partner, you really do need to engage with a data scientist to actually do the work really well yourselves. And we're not at that point yet. We just redid all our job descriptions, and we're trying to make sure that our descriptions are consistent throughout our industry. So we can compare apples to apples when we're benchmarking and looking at the different positions. And we have so many different levels for engineers, designers. So it's not easy. But it's hard work, I guess. And so I think that the fact that we're doing it is good, but we know that we have more work that we can and will continue to do to try to always get there. It's not something you do one time. It never ends. So I guess that's the good news. And then just intentionally, like someone had said, maybe fast tracking employees, building those escalators to try to move women and people of color higher up within the organization, and be very intentional about hiring. So it all goes in together. But, you know, you wake up every day and something new can happen, and you have to look at your policies and realize, like, if you're doing special sign-on bonuses for key recruits who you're hiring, you can't just do that when people are really pushing and negotiating well for more money, and then you're giving them a better package, because we know the people who will do that tend to be people who tend to be more white males, and maybe women of color not as negotiating as well. So we want to just be very, very careful and look at every possible way.
Mhm.
So I hope that's helpful.
Well, it is. I mean, you just sort of pinpointed two things for me. One was about the hiring, and the other was the escalator.
Mhm.
And the escalator, it's a wonderful concept, because that's exactly what Kathy was mentioning earlier. We have to keep moving people up, but it sort of captures the dynamic that we should be trying to structure
Yeah.
with all of our signers.
Yeah.
It's great.
Thank you.
Thank you. One more person, and we'll run out of time here, but somebody else want to at least?
Anybody
comment?
in the chat? Oh, there's compliments in the chat. Questions, we need questions.
Brave souls to share your perspective.
Yeah.
Usually Boston is not this quiet.
Maybe another question is, are there ways we can help you more?
Yeah.
It's a great question.
I thought there was a tool or something that we could utilize that was a new kind of maybe formula or something that we could take back to our companies that will better help us do the math. I always find it, I'm not a technical person, so I find this extremely confusing.
We all do. You're not alone.
It is coming. We do have the math and we do have the equations on our website. We are putting together an employer wage gap calculator that we hope will be able to be introduced in April and early April. And that you'll still have to sort of do the math in terms of aggregation, but it's going to put it in to, our hope is that you'll put these numbers into the calculator. They'll basically do the division for you and compare it, spit it out on a results page that will be compared to the BWC 2021. So stay tuned. That's coming. It's in process.
So let me turn this back to you, but my sense of this and what's interesting to me is how hard this is to talk about, even among us signers. And that's okay. I mean, we need to keep making the connections, and maybe it's one-on-one with all of you, with our staff, but please keep us in mind. Tell us, as Kathy said, how can we help you deal with this? Because that's what we're here for.
Yeah.
And we want to change these numbers as much as you do. So engage us in telling us how we can help you. Back to you, Kim.
Thanks, Ev and Kathy. And thank you all Compact Signers for your time today. It's been fascinating. And again, I want to reiterate what Ev and Kathy said. Let us know if there's anything, we'll be in touch, but we're not necessarily always in touch at the right time. If you think of something, don't hesitate to contact us. I want to let you know, I sort of alluded to this before, that one way that we do get information about what you're doing and what you think is working so that we can share these best practices are our Innovative Initiative Awards. And it recognizes the amazing interventions at your organization. So our Q2 program, which should be in June, is going to celebrate the winners. You will see an application and probably emails asking you to apply in early March, and it will be open for about, I think, 3 weeks. So we really encourage you all to think about that now, about things that you think, hey, we did this and we actually saw it work, so that we can celebrate you among Compact Signers, among Boston, among the press. So thank you so much for today. Have a great day. We really appreciate your coming, and thanks again for everything you do.